Okay, this video is on congruent triangles, and the definition of congruent triangles says that two triangles are congruent if and only if their corresponding angles are congruent and their corresponding sides are congruent. Sometimes you hear that said as all the corresponding parts of two triangles have to be congruent in order for the triangles to be congruent. So we're going to take a look at how we identify and then write down a congruency statement for congruent triangles. So example number one, we have these two triangles ABC and DEF, and I can see by looking at the picture that these three angles in triangle ABC are congruent to these three angles in triangle DEF, and these three sides, this side is congruent to this side, this one congruent to this side, and this side congruent to this side. So I've got corresponding angles congruent, and I've got corresponding sides congruent, so I know these two triangles must be congruent. So I'm going to start out by writing down my pairs of corresponding angles. So angle A and angle D are congruent. I'll just go ahead and write it like this with my congruency symbol. A is congruent to angle D. Angle B is congruent to angle E, and angle C is congruent to angle F. And the congruency symbol you can see is just an equals, kind of looks like an equal sign with a little squiggly mark over the top. My congruent sides, all right, again, I've got those labeled here in my picture, side AB and side DE. So I can say AB is congruent to side DE, BC and EF. BC is congruent to EF, and AC is congruent to DF. AC congruent to DF. Now, using this, I want to write down what's called the congruency statement, and this is just the statement that says this triangle is congruent to this triangle, but it's important to write down the vertices of the triangles in the correct order. In particular, you want to write them down in corresponding order. So if A and D are corresponding angles, you want to make sure that they both go in the same position in the congruency statement. So if A goes first in this triangle, D has to go first in this triangle. If B goes first in this, if B goes second in this triangle, A, B, then its corresponding angle, angle E, needs to go second in this triangle. And C, if C goes last in this triangle, then its corresponding angle, F, has to go last in this triangle. So the congruency statement for these two triangles just says triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. Example number two. Here I've got two triangles. I've got 1, 2, 3 angles here. This angle is congruent to this angle. This angle is congruent to this angle. These two angles are right angles, so they're congruent. I've got this side congruent to this side congruent to this side, and this side congruent to this side. So I've got all of my corresponding parts congruent, so I know these two triangles must be congruent. So let's write down, again, all the corresponding, that is, all the congruent angles. So let's see, angle P congruent to angle W. Angle Q is congruent to angle V, and angle R is congruent to angle U. My congruent sides, PQ congruent to WV, QR is congruent to VU, and let's see, PR is congruent to WU. Now I can write down my congruency statement. PQR, triangle PQR, is congruent to triangle WVU. And again, notice I've got them in order. I've got them in congruency order. P is congruent to W. Angle Q is congruent to V. and angle R is congruent to angle U. Now notice I could have also written down another congruency statement for these two triangles that would have been just as good. I could have, for example, let's say, instead of calling this triangle PQR, how about if I call it triangle RPQ? Triangle RPQ. Well, now if I'm going to name this triangle RPQ, then my congruency statement is going to have to change, because remember, I want my angles in order. I want them in congruency, in corresponding order. So RPQ then would be congruent to UWV. UWV. And you see that little note there at the bottom of your notes. Remember, to write the congruency statement, you want to always list the angles in corresponding order in the triangle's names. Each one of the angles has to correspond. The first angle has to correspond to its congruent angle, its corresponding angle, and so on. All right, example number 3. Now here I've got two triangles, except now I notice that they are not in the same orientation. They're not facing the same direction, so I have to be a little more careful when I'm writing down my corresponding angles and corresponding sides. So let's see. My corresponding angles, my congruent angles, angle J. J is not congruent to M. J is congruent to P, since they both have the same single curve hash marks. Angle K is congruent to angle N. And let's see, angle L is congruent to angle P. All right. Now I want to list my pairs of congruent sides. So let's see, JK is congruent to PN. Let's see, JK, PN. KL is congruent to NM. And JL is congruent to PM. And I think I'm missing a hash mark there. Yeah, JL, there should be 3 hash marks in that triangle. All right, now I want to write my congruency statement. So again, I want to make sure that I have my corresponding parts all matching up here. So let's see. How about if I go JKL for this triangle? So if that's the order I'm going in for this triangle, let's see, angle J and angle P go together, so P needs to be first. K and N go together, so N needs to be second. And L and M go together. So JKL, triangle JKL is congruent to triangle PNM. All right, example number 4. All right, here again, I've got two triangles that they're not facing the same direction, so I want to be careful about identifying my congruent angles and congruent sides. So let's see. Angle E, let's start with angle E. Angle E is congruent to angle R. Angle G is congruent to angle I. And angle O is congruent to angle T. Okay, let's see. For the sides, EG and RI are congruent. EG is congruent to RI. EG, RI, yeah. Let's see. GO is congruent to IT. And let's see. EO is congruent to RT. So now once again I can write my congruency statement. I want to make sure I get my angles in corresponding order. So let's see, how about, let's go EGO. So triangle EGO is congruent to triangle R, let's see, G and I, RIT. And I have my angles in corresponding order. Example number 5. Okay, now this one, at first glance it looks like we may have trouble with this one because if I go to list my corresponding angles, that is my congruent angles, it looks like I only have, let's see, it looks like I only have 2 pairs of congruent angles. I've got angle A and angle E are congruent. And I've got angle B and angle D are congruent. But these 2 angles here, it doesn't look like they are congruent. Actually, let me call this angle 1 and angle 2 here just to distinguish between those 2 angles. And when I first look at it, I see they don't have any hash marks, so I might be tempted to say, well, they're not congruent. But since I know this pair of angles is a pair of vertical angles, and since I know that vertical angles are always congruent, I know that angle 1 must be congruent to angle 2. So I'm just going to add in these hash marks here, put a set of 3 hash marks in there. Since these are vertical angles, I know they must be congruent, so I can say, well, angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. So this angle in this triangle is congruent to this angle in this triangle. So now I do have all 3 angles of this triangle congruent to all 3 angles of this triangle. Now again, when I go to write down the congruent sides for the triangle, again it looks like I'm going to have some problems here because it looks like I only have side AB congruent to side DE. Let's see, AB congruent to side, write that ED. And if I don't have all 3 sides of one triangle congruent to all 3 sides of another triangle, those 2 triangles are not going to be congruent. However, in this case, I notice I have some additional information given to me that's not labeled on the triangle. In particular, it says there that C, point C, is the midpoint of segment AE. Well, if point C, that is this point right here, is the midpoint of AE, I know that a midpoint divides a segment into 2 congruent segments, which means that segment AC and segment EC must be congruent. That's what it means for C to be the midpoint. So these 2 sides here, this side of this triangle and this side of this triangle, are congruent. I'm also told that C is the midpoint of segment BD. So again, I know that this point divides this segment into 2 congruent segments, which means I can label these as congruent also. So I can write that AC is congruent to EC and BC is congruent to DC. And now I do have all 3 pairs of corresponding angles congruent and all 3 pairs of corresponding sides congruent. Now I can write my congruency statement. So let's see, triangle ABC is congruent to triangle, so let's see, A goes with E, B goes with D, B goes with D, and C on this triangle goes with C on this triangle. So there's my congruency statement for example number 5.